Corning, California, home to the Big Olive and not much else. Well, that's not entirely true. Corning is where one of my favorite sporting stories in Northern California ever took place. A little-known PE teacher by the name of Pauline Foster would take the reins of Corning High School in 1942, becoming California's first female football coach. An opposing coach would opine he'd rather serve in World War II than lose to Foster. Her story is one that would even appear in Time magazine, although there's a bit of an asterisk behind that. The weird thing, though, is that Pauline Foster just disappears before the 1940s ends. It's a story that's sadly been lost to time, but a tale worth telling and proof something interesting sporting-wise can happen even here in Corning, California. This is the history and the mystery of California's first female football coach. Corning Union High School had a bit of a problem as the 1942 football season approached. The head coach, Herbert Comstock, had left to serve in the war. And with those war efforts, a lot of able-bodied men were, like Comstock, serving either overseas or domestically. That meant there weren't a lot of men with football knowledge to help lead the Cardinals. The school's principal, J. Roland Jackson, didn't know football from an olive pit. And there was also the music instructor here, Irving Fritz, but again, he wasn't really a sports guy. Music teachers aren't always going to be, or rarely are, sports guys. And this left one individual able to coach the Corning Union High School football team in 1942, but it was a bit of a left-field candidate. That would be women's physical education instructor Pauline Foster. Foster arrived in Corning by way of Berkeley. She had attended Cal, graduated with a degree in physical education, and was an active sportswoman. She played tennis, she played golf, badminton. She was really into physical education. I mean, that's obviously why she majored in it. She was big into dances and social events. In 1938, she married Dorothy Foster of Vallejo, a journalist who had actually attended the University of Colorado. At some point in time, the couple ends up moving here to the city of Corning. Foster, Mrs. Foster that is, would take up a job here with the high school. When autumn 1942 comes along and Corning Union needs someone to coach the football team, she raises her hand and volunteers. Now, when this happens, there really isn't a whole lot in the way of fanfare. Quite frankly, the school year in Corning here during 1942 and in those olden times was a bit of a joke. I mean, the school doesn't even open until the last week of September. I mean, please sign me up for that high school schedule, please. That's absolutely absurd because when I was in high school, we were starting like in the third week of August, but that's just how they did it back then. Anyway, Foster isn't put in charge until a week before the team's first game. There are a few practices, but no one's really expecting a heck of a lot out of those Cardinals when they head into their first matchup of that 1942 football season. That matchup was a big one because it was against longtime rival, traditional rival to this day, the Orland Trojans. By the way, if you're unfamiliar with this part of Northern California, the upper Sacramento Valley, there were all of these small farming communities. You have Willows, you have Williams, Arbuckle, Orland, and of course Corning here. Each one not only thinks they're cool, but they also think they are far superior than the other towns. It's so ridiculous because, quite frankly, they're all a slightly modified version of the same thing, and that thing is pretty uninteresting if we're being honest. Sorry, Corning, Williams, Arbuckle, Orland, Willows, and all of the like, but you're just not that great, and you're certainly not better than anyone. That aside, to this day, Corning versus Orland is a big deal in these parts of California. But the 1942 matchup was going to be historic, the best thing since sliced olives, canned olives, pitted olives, olive loaves. Can I be real with you for a second? Olives are gross.
The fucking olive!
Anyway, Foster's counterpart in that Corning-Orland clash of 1942, well, He was a bit of a name. He had some football cachet. Orland's coach was a former NFL player and college legend for St. Mary's, Al Nicolini. He'd actually applied to serve in the Navy. He was really just waiting to be called up by the military, which meant he was in charge of the Orland Trojans for that game. Those in Northern California, in particular wine aficionados, may recognize the Nicolini name, and yes, in fact, he was one of the children of the Nicolini winery family. Born in St. Helena, California, he was second-generation Nicolini. Not only was he a former professional football player, but also a grape grower to boot. Them's is fighting words here in Corning. This wasn't just two local high school rivals playing. It was a former NFL player facing off against a woman with no football coaching experience and someone who'd only been employed here working for Corning High School for a couple of weeks at this point in time. Safe to say everyone was surprised when CUHS ran out a comfortable winner 14-0. A win and a shutout? On the road, no less. Honestly, I don't know how much of a surprise it was. First and foremost, Foster probably knew a thing or two about football, and I'd imagine she attended at least a handful of Cal Berkeley football games while she was in school. And I think more importantly, there was a good dialogue between her and the team. It wasn't just she was coming in as some dictator, but she was working with them. She was trying to understand what they were doing. There was a plan in place for Corning. Do not tell that to Orland coach Al Nicolini, who did not take too kindly to losing to a lady coach. In fact, his fateful words after that loss were he'd never lived down to defeat and he was looking forward to being in the military as opposed to suffering the indignity of losing to a girl. While Nicolini suffered through a midlife crisis, Foster and her Cardinals did not have any time to rest on their laurels, for up next was a showdown with another one of these Northern California Valley towns. That time, it was the Willows Honkers on deck. Corning Union was dealing with a spate of injuries, including one to star quarterback Wayne Maddox. They'd go into the game under strength. Willow's a pretty good team in 1942. It should also be noted that the Corning Union High School football team, well, they weren't practicing a hell of a lot because it was olive harvest season. That meant they needed to be out in the fields. As you can guess, these conditions weren't ideal for Foster's first game here in Corning. It was to be Foster's home opener. The Cardinals were trounced by the Honkers 34-0 with the side unable to overcome those injuries and a lack of preparation. The loss, though, was in the past. On deck for Corning would be a return fixture against those Orland Trojans. That one right here at Cardinal Stadium, and safe to say those preparation conditions did not get any better for Foster and her boys. It was peak olive season in Corning, meaning the school was just flat out canceling classes. There were some informal practices, but yeah, again, the conditions not great for preparing a football team to take on their rival. But hey, the olive harvest was good, so that's something. The Trojans were on the up, having won against Colusa after that loss to Corning. Things for the Cardinals get off to a really good start in the first half of that matchup. In fact, they go into halftime with a 6-0 lead over Orland. Sadly, the newspaper had to go to press at halftime, meaning you'd have to wait for Monday's edition for the final score. Only it's not there. You have to go to Orland's newspaper to find out who won between Corning and Orland in 1942, and that would be Al Nicolini's side. The former Gale got his revenge and eventually his wish, being made a Navy lieutenant later in November. As for Pauline Foster, in the spring she'd coached the Corning men's basketball team, but really, her story goes quiet until September 1943, and then she becomes a national sensation, well, sort of. Time magazine publishes an article on a woman coaching high school football in Pennsylvania, Pauline Ruff. Foster's brother, Morris Lowenthal, took great umbrage to the fact that Pauline in Pennsylvania was getting recognition for doing something his sister had done the year previously. So he sends in a letter to the editor of Time magazine with a picture of his sister in what looks to be a bathing suit, talking about, well, Pauline Foster, she was coaching football as a woman before this Pauline Ruff character did it, and also she's no tomboy to boot. Then for whatever reason, a bunch of newspapers in Northern California pick up this story and they frame it as Time magazine features a local woman who coaches football. That, though, isn't what happened. This was a letter to an editor written by her brother, not some big piece. It wasn't Time magazine focusing on Pauline Foster, but those newspapers, man, they really loved local woman in Time magazine a whole lot more. But it actually gets weirder. Foster had left her post here at Corning Union High School in the summer of 1943. So when that letter to the editor is published, not only is she not coaching football, she's not even in the town anymore. And you're probably wondering to yourself, well, where did Foster go? She taught physical education at a school in Crockett, closer to where she grew up in the East Bay, for a year before joining the American Red Cross in 1944 to serve overseas during the war. Around 1949, Pauline Foster disappears, which is fairly remarkable, and not just because she was California's first female football coach. It's because, well, up until the 1960s, simply living, simply being alive was enough to get you into some newspaper somewhere in California. Seriously, they would report on people taking trips or what their holiday plans were. The bar of newsworthy back then was not particularly high. This dead end was such a mystery. What happened to California's first female football coach? And where it led me was to a bigger issue, a societal issue at that. When a woman takes on the last name of her husband through marriage, she more or less dies, disappears. Unless you can find an announcement or some sort of news item or some sort of record of the marriage, it's almost as if the woman lives two separate, distinct lives, one under her maiden name and then one under her married name. It just sort of, there is just this dead end of that split. That is what makes it so difficult in piecing together the stories of all of America's first female football coaches. They were either going under their married name, which meant finding what they did before that was impossible because it would have been under their maiden name, and if there's no announcement, you wouldn't find anything. Or in other cases, they were simply going by their husband's name. They were Mrs. Joe Ward. In the case of Pauline Foster, we did get that connection between her maiden life and her married life. As you can recall, there was that marriage announcement in Vallejo when she married Dorothy Foster. Pauline Lowenthal, but again, what happened in the late 1940s? She goes over, she serves in the American Red Cross, she comes back here to the North Bay and the East Bay and resumes teaching. Then her story goes dark. I had to go back to that Time magazine letter to the editor, which was penned by her brother, Morris Lowenthal, and that would be the key to unlocking what happened to Pauline Foster. He passed away in the mid-1980s, and in his obituary, it mentions his sister, Pauline Toshi. So it turns out that Pauline Foster had divorced her first husband and then was remarried sometime, I don't have a specific date, but sometime between 1948 and 1950. She married Louis Toshi, who was, much like herself, a school instructor, a coach, an avid sports person. He would work for several local high schools during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, coaching basketball, coaching baseball, and of course, really just helping shape the youth of this part of California. As for Pauline, she works for several different schools in the same area. She's a big dance instructor. She loved teaching people how to dance. At some point, she decides to return to school to earn a master's degree in psychology, and by the 70s, she has matriculated to the College of Marin, where she would serve as a counselor there. She's regularly involved with both the YWCA and local Jewish communities in Marin and Contra Costa counties. She plays golf and tennis well into her 70s, oftentimes with her husband, Louis. One of the most amazing things about the story of Pauline Toshi, Pauline Foster, is that in her late 50s, she even manages to knock in a hole-in-one, her first hole-in-one. That is something I can only dream to accomplish, let alone at the age of 59. While Pauline Toshi did have a fulfilling life after coaching football at Corning Union High School back in the 1940s, those high-profile opportunities in the sport for women would dry up quickly once World War II ended. Somewhat annoyingly, in 1963, Marion Crowe, the wife of LA Rams player coach Lyndon Crowe, did this media tour saying women could never coach football. Their role was to stand by the men and tell them how great they were. Women were coaching football decades before someone gave you a platform to spew that nonsense. And it is that mindset, that approach, not just from men, but from women, that really limited what women could do in the sport of football, really up until the past 10, 15, 20 years. Yes, there were not a huge number of female coaches in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, but they were there. And if the trend had been allowed to continue, if they were welcomed into the football community, the situation would have improved greatly. Sadly, it was the mindset of Marion Crowe and others like her that became prevalent, that became entrenched in the sport of football. The only reason Pauline Foster, Pauline Toshi, and many other women who did take up coaching football during World War I and World War II is because it just wasn't socially acceptable. The men came home from war and that became their domain once more. To that end, Foster even said shortly after that first season at the helm of the Corning Cardinals that she wished she could continue coaching football, that she found it to be an enjoyable experience and one she wanted to continue on with. That of course doesn't happen. When Pauline Toshi returned here first to Contra Costa County, where she was born and raised, and then later in Marin County over there, her story of being California's first female football coach, it became, I can't even classify it as a footnote. It just became a blip in football history. Just an unimportant factoid. Even finding the exploit of Foster and her contemporaries, those women football coaches in the early 20th century, is difficult. Potential female role models have been diminished. And why? For what? So men didn't have to be threatened when it came to being involved with football, so locker rooms could remain the domain of dongs flopping freely in the wind. Get out of here with that. You might drive through a city like Corning and not make much of it, but history, even sporting history, can happen in towns like this. And we get stories like that of Pauline Foster, who was undoubtedly a trailblazer, but more importantly, she embodies everything that makes America great. Fearless, selfless, modest, from being California's first female football coach to serving for the Red Cross overseas during the war, to coaching and teaching the next generations, to hitting a hole in one, to, yes, even being easy on the eyes back in her younger days, at least according to her brother. In a Time magazine letter to the editor, she lived life on her terms, and she certainly lived a life worth living. Sadly, both Pauline and Louis Toshi passed away in 2005 while living in Santa Rosa. They were both in their late 80s. I couldn't find any record of children or relatives. There was no obituary for either one, but may their memory and Pauline Foster, Pauline Toshi's legendary exploits here in Corning, California live on forever. Pauline Foster, Pauline Toshi, California's first female football coach, and no tomboy either. Thank you for watching this video from the aforementioned Corning, California, a place that is none too interesting unless you love olives. I'm Cheyenne Hollis. This is The Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.